Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namam Dubs, Namam Dubs, Namam Dubs. Good morning. Thank you for joining me on this Sunday. I'm talking to you today from my new office. You'll notice it's a little bit different looking than the old office. It's also a little bit more bare at the moment. So I'll work on putting up a little bit more decor in the future. And if I look a little bit tired, it's because I've been putting in some long hours lately. So I apologize for the hideously haggard version of my face that you're looking at today. I haven't been sleeping well because my daughter is teething. And if you have kids and you've been through the infant phase, you know what that's like. Baby's waking up in the middle of the night quite a bit, crying because of her teeth. And because the baby's crying, I am also crying. Mila currently has about 4 teeth, and there's another one coming in. And I have to say that all those teeth do not look adorable. They actually look truly, truly gnarly. They look like Louis Anderson teeth at the moment. And these Louis Anderson teeth definitely keep my daughter up all night, and therefore me as well. The good news is that being up for weird hours does give me ample time to think about other matters, like Dharma messages, and to clear my mind as I think about what I could talk about for these opportunities where we get to kind of gab about the Dharma together. And I thought, what better topic to really talk about in terms of my appreciation for Jodo Shinshu and Buddhism as a whole, and the wisdom of the Buddha. What better topic than teeth? Because it's right on brand. So the story I told you about Mila's teeth is pretty boring. You've heard something like it before, I am sure. And I'm sure you've probably got your own better teeth stories as well. Whether it's like a way that you got a tooth knocked out, or when you were little and lost a tooth, or a tooth fairy story, or weird dreams about having loose teeth and pulling them out, or maybe it's one of those things where people compare the awfulness of the cavities that they've had and they try to one up each other. You probably got a good tooth story as well, I have to say. But that being said, I've got an even better one. I promise you, it's a better tooth story than any tooth story you've heard before. And it is a tooth story that doesn't come from Jodo Shinshu, but it is a tooth story that does play an incredible role in another sect of Buddhism, that of the Theravada form of Sri Lankan Buddhism. And part of this is because there is a Sri Lankan Buddhist sect that actually has in their possession what they believe to be an actual tooth of the Buddha. This tooth is currently housed in the city of Kandy, Sri Lanka, in a giant temple that is called, wait for it, the Temple of the Tooth. It is perfectly on brand, right? So the story of the tooth goes something like this. After the historical Buddha Shakyamuni passed away, he was cremated, as were part of his instructions. And the legend tells that there was a collection of bones that remained, part of clavicle, some other things, after he was cremated. And as much as 3 teeth were seen in his remains. And one of these teeth, one tooth, was picked up by one of his loyal followers. And this individual took the tooth and treated it as an item to be worshipped. So basically, I know that might seem a little strange to modern audiences, but the tooth would be regarded as a relic, a human relic. And human relics have a long history of being worshipped, honored, or, kind of cherished, especially when they come from someone who is regarded as holy or divine. And the Buddha, of course, would have been believed to be exactly this by some sects of Buddhism. And the relics of his body were in some cases believed to provide even supernatural powers and that sort of thing. So, and this particular tooth actually has a long reputation of, again, it's not really something that we practice in Jodo Shinshu, but it has a reputation amongst other individuals, a lore to it, let's say, of being a source of almost divine power. The former kings of Sri Lanka believed that the tooth itself was a source of power for the kings, and whoever had possession of the tooth was the ruler of the area by right. So whoever had the tooth took it with them, and they were the ruler, and it was an actual thing. Uh, and beyond that, the tooth also had like actual powers as well, supposedly, in terms of how people talked about the legend of the tooth. For example, there was a bunch of interesting stories and rumors about how the tooth granted rainfall during barren seasons and assured absolute victory in battle, and also supposedly had supernatural healing powers as well. So it's not an ordinary tooth, I guess, according to the old legends. So anyway, the way this works is that the legend continues is that this individual that takes the tooth actually takes it out of India during this period of time. And as the story grows, the reputation of the tooth kind of grows in power as well. The disciple, as I said, takes the tooth to India, to the coastal kingdom of Kalinga, where it is accepted by an old Hindu king who watches over it for something like 800 years or something like that, or his line watches over it for like 800 years. Eventually, as the tooth begins to get more people fawning over it, praising it, treating it as like the actual body of the Buddha, because it is the physical incarnation of the Buddha. Eventually, a neighboring Hindu king named Pandu tries to get it. He basically tries to go to war and sends a Raja over to retrieve the tooth through combat. And he actually finally succeeds in getting this tooth from Kalinga. And when he does so, he decides that he's actually kind of sick of all the adoration that it receives. And in a moment, he decides that he's going to destroy the tooth. And he says, I'm going to throw it into a pit of hot coals. You know, kind of like Golem and Frodo and Lord of the Rings. But, according to the legend, when he's about to throw it in, and this is according to Jose Gerson de Aquana in an 1875 memoir on the history of the tooth relic Celian, he, quote, the order was obeyed by the mystical power, by the mystical power of the relic, a lotus flower the size of a chariot wheel arose above the flames, and the sacred tooth, emitting rays which ascended through the skies and illuminated the universe, alighted at the top. End quote. And because this Hindu king was so overwhelmed by this sight, this power, he eventually succumbs to the tooth and becomes a Buddhist himself, and in turn returns it back to where it came from. So that's one of the legends that surrounds the tooth. But the story is way stranger than that. And it gets even weirder. Because after this period of time, the tooth being in conflict and then of course returned, it leads into another era that's regarded as the Tooth Wars. So anyway, after the tooth is returned, a king from the north attacks the city to capture it, and he's defeated. But then others get the same idea, like we can also get this tooth through combat. And as a result of that, more people start to attack the city. And eventually, at some point in time, another disciple has to smuggle the tooth out of the city within their hair. And this is how the tooth actually ends up in Mahasena of Celion in Sri Lanka. And from that point in time, the journey of the tooth becomes very complex and very debatable, I would say. At this point in time, the tooth survives. Or maybe it doesn't survive the occupation of Sri Lanka by the Portuguese Christian colonizers in the 1560s. There are some who believe that the tooth was actually destroyed at this period of time because it was taken from the city by Portuguese soldiers and who immediately recognized its value because a number of lords, especially the king from Burma, tried to purchase the tooth in order to get it back. And the viceroy who obtained it was going to sell it for money, but eventually was overtaken by a Catholic archbishop who, when they got a hold of the tooth, decided that its very existence was kind of an affront to God as a whole. This was, of course, kind of an extension of the Inquisition. And as a result of this, the archbishop actually had the tooth not just destroyed, but like ground into powder and like discarded into the river, so it could no longer be worshipped anymore. This is according to one source, several sources. But as I said, this is a bit of a point of disagreement by many, and it is something that is very contentious because many in Sri Lanka believe that the tooth that was taken by the Portuguese was actually a very valuable ape tooth, or perhaps merely a replica, and not the actual tooth of the Buddha. Others actually argue that the tooth in question that was ground up was not really, that the story about the tooth being ground up was not really that credible, and that was basically like the tooth was never destroyed in the first place, and that the actual tooth remains in Sri Lanka. Others would argue that it was retrieved in the time of the Rajashina II, and because of all these differing perspectives and differing historical arguments about what actually happened to the tooth, I don't pretend to know what happened to it. All I know is that the legitimacy of the tooth is a point of debate for many people. And so I'll simply say that because I have no idea, I can't really comment on it. I will say, however, that the Sri Lankans, who currently have possession of a tooth, the tooth, they firmly believe that the tooth that they have in Kandy at the Temple of the Tooth is the historical Buddha's tooth. So if that's confusing to you, I don't blame you. Because again, we're talking about things that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and as a result of that, hard to get to the bottom of. So what do we make of all this, though? You got this incredible story of a tooth, the tooth of the Buddha that travels across continents and countries and lines, that is sort of fought over by kings throughout history, that supposedly has magical powers, that illuminated the world at one point in time, that was used as a political pawn, that was, of course, like ground into dust by Portuguese Christians, or perhaps saved, or perhaps there are duplicates that exist, is a fascinatingly complex story, and it's hard for us to really get a grip on it. But as wild as that story is, and as complex as it might be, what I do know about it, and what I believe, is that the tooth of the Temple of the Tooth is inarguably one of the most important attractions in all of Sri Lanka today. And it is an incredibly important location of faith and a location of devotion for Theravadan Buddhists around the world. And as time goes on, if you were to go over to Sri Lanka and view this Temple of the Tooth, you'd undoubtedly see just seas of Thai monks and Chinese tourists and other Buddhist faithful who show up to this temple to show their respect to the Buddha. And I think that in the end, that's what matters the most. Not really whether the tooth is authentic or not, or what actually happened to the tooth. That's a fascinating mystery, like so many other mysteries in history. But it's the acknowledgement that the tooth itself is a source of absolute pride for the country, and a reminder of the fascinating, deep, rich, and complex history of Buddhist practice around the world, how much it's grown, and how much political and social upheaval it has overcome. And how by taking the time to reflect on something as peculiar as this story is still an opportunity to better understand the Dharma as a whole. A monk by the name of the Venerable Master Xingwen went to India to establish a separate stupa. This is a bit separate. For another temple that was honoring a different tooth relic from the historical Buddha. Remember I said that there were 3 originally? Well, this is a different one. So they actually had one of these in India, and they established an enormous monument and a temple to honor it. And the Venerable Master said this about the tooth, and I think it sums it up perfectly. He said that the Buddha does not need anyone's worship or reverence. It is living beings that need the inspiration to develop wholesome thoughts and purify their minds. By worshiping a memorial, people can come to know the Buddha's Dharma body and their feelings of admiration can be elevated into wanting to learn about the Buddha's virtues and practice them every day. The Buddha does not need a memorial, but living beings do. And he said that's what inspired him to come to that temple, to help establish it and to bless it. And I think that this says it perfectly. While our practices are different from those of the Sri Lankans, and while Mahayana Buddhism is very different in many ways from Theravada Buddhism, while the Jodo Shinshu understanding of the Dharma can differ dramatically from many others around the world, whether it's a tooth of the Buddha, or whether it's the name of the Buddha, our reverence to the Buddha and our gratitude for the teachings of the Buddha are the same. And how we express it and how they express it, to me, are both sources of tremendous opportunity for us to really step outside our comfort zones and understand just how much we have in common and how interconnected we really are. And with 84,000 Dharma gates at our disposal, there are plenty of opportunities for us to step outside our comfort zones, lay aside our daily assumptions, and see the world at a different angle. Thank you for listening. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amidabits, Namo Amidabits, Namo Amidabits, Namondaps, Namondaps, Namondaps.